Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much for staying. I think I'm the 29th person talking at you this conference. I think Christy will be shocked to hear that Kaylin's talk was actually today, the same day. We're still today. So I'm going to keep it short and simple, kind of taking a discussant role here. I have an alternate title for my talk since I came up with the one I sent them, which is, do you want to be credible or incredible? And I'm going to argue that at least in the social sciences, maybe astrophysics can have findings that are both credible and incredible, but we study something so messy and so complicated that incredible claims are almost by definition not credible. I think it's very hard to be both when you're studying something so complicated. Okay, so first, I've learned a lot of things at this conference already. I put my ORCID ID on the first slide thanks to a tweet somebody wrote, and then disclosures. This is new for me. So these are some sources of funding. I have another confession to make. I have no formal training in Metascience. So what I'm going to be talking about today is just some casual observations from being in kind of the eye of the replicability storm as a social and personality psychologist, as a journal editor, as a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Reproducibility, which I resigned from, other kinds of experiences like that, trying to change a system from within, sometimes getting frustrated and exiting the system. And so a lot of what I'm going to be saying is really amateur philosophy and sociology of science as somebody who has lived it, and I don't really know how to formalize these things. So I'm hoping that with this audience, you guys can help me turn this into more testable, rigorous predictions. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the question of how do we know when to trust a scientific claim? And there's different things that have been proposed as ways that we can make this call. And I'm going to argue that 3 of the ones that have been proposed I don't think are viable, and I'm going to argue for a 4th, which is the idea that we can't really evaluate individual scientific claims very well, at least if we're not exactly in that area. But maybe there's hope that we could evaluate how rigorous the culture is in a scientific field or community, and then we can calibrate the credibility of that field according to that. I'll talk about my field as an example of a research culture that has some problems. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about what are the characteristics of a credible research culture, in my opinion, and then challenges for metascience. So first, as I mentioned, I'm not going to talk individually about why the scientific method and so on are not viable ways to decide whether a scientific claim is true, although I will note, so for example, the scientific method, every philosopher of science I talk to tells me that nobody believes that anymore, that there's such a thing, and that there's this clear demarcation. But it's still in all the textbooks, at least the ones I've seen, not philosophy of science textbooks, but like undergrad research methods textbooks in the sciences. The second one, the idea that we can critically evaluate each claim. We're smart people, we have good reasoning skills, et cetera. Even most of us are scientists. But as Jevin just showed, I don't know what stomatoconductance is. I can't evaluate that. And even in a more closely neighboring field, I'm not really in a good position to evaluate claims about long-term memory versus short-term memory or things like that. There's really only a very narrow range of scientific claims where I'm an expert enough to evaluate the validity of the claim by digging into the research itself. Authority, it sounds like a weird one to put on the list because at least when I teach my undergrad research methods class, I say what's different about science is we don't appeal to authority. But I saw a pretty compelling TED Talk by Naomi Oreskes where she argues that actually a lot of how we decide whether to believe a scientific claim is due to authority, but not the authority of an individual, but the authority of a scientific community. And I've heard other people appeal to this idea that, well, there's textbook science. There's the things that have passed a really high test and that there's really good consensus on in a community. And I would argue that there's so many things in textbooks that shouldn't be there and shouldn't be trusted. And so I don't think, at least there's some fields where authority, even consensus within that field, isn't really a good guide of what should be trusted. Okay, so there's this paradox about people's trust in science, which is that this is a result from the Pew study that just came out. And I want you to focus on the bottom half below the dotted line and the green dots. So the green dots are these respondents. They're Americans, non-scientists for the most part, answers to the questions about scientists. So the first column is medical research scientists. The second one is nutrition research scientists. The third one is environmental research scientists, so the green dots. And the last 3 rows are percent of adults who say that the scientists provide fair and accurate information, so it's 32, 24, 35, are transparent about conflicts of interest, 15, 12, 17, admit and take responsibility for mistakes, 12, 11, 14. The public knows that we're not individually trustworthy, right? They know that scientists are not noble. They don't have delusions about that. And yet, trust in science is quite high. So the second set of bars there in green is trust in science over time, according to this Pew survey. So the vast majority of Americans have at least a fair amount of trust in science, and some have a great deal of trust in science, and that's been going up. So I think this is an interesting paradox. The public knows that we're not individually trustworthy and noble and accurate and disclose our conflicts and admit when we're wrong, but they think that science works. They think the system works. And why is that? I think it's because they trust our culture. They trust the system. And this is actually something that Naomi also said, Naomi Oreskes in her TED Talk, that scientists have a kind of cultural collective distrust, this kind of show me culture. Or as a philosopher of science, Susan Hack, wrote that science has an internal social organization that helps keep most scientists most of the time reasonably honest. Closer to my own field, Don Campbell in 1984 wrote that the resulting dependability of reports comes from a social process rather than from dependence upon the honesty and competence of any single experimenter. Organized distrust produces trustworthy reports. And organized distrust is a phrase he got from Merton. It's sometimes called organized skepticism. And one more quote from another philosopher of science: the existence of strong and rigid self-policing and self-controlling mechanisms built into scientific communities, preventing access by incompetent or dishonest people, allows it to be taken for granted that those who pass through the checks of gatekeepers can be trusted. So I think the reason why a lot of people trust science and the extent to which they trust science is the extent to which they believe these checks are in place, so that even though we're self-interested individually, even though we don't admit when we're wrong, and so on, these gatekeeping and policing efforts keep us in check. Okay, so I think that psychology and the social sciences, there's some evidence that this hasn't happened. It hasn't worked well. I don't think it's for lack of trying. I think we thought we were doing these things, but I won't rehash the evidence. You've heard 28 other talks. But here's a summary of rigorous large-scale replication attempts. I'm not including one-off replications with small sample sizes. These are, for almost every single study up here, there was pre-registration, there was a relatively large sample size, there was often consultation with the original authors, et cetera. And if we take this as an estimate of the false discovery rate in these sciences, and this is mostly psychology, but there's a few other social sciences, it's something like 55%, but with a lot of uncertainty. So maybe the false discovery rate isn't 55%, maybe it's only 45% or 40%, but it's quite high, and many of these were targeting studies published in our very top journals. So I don't think that that's what a reader would expect, that there's a coin flip chance or something around that the study wouldn't replicate. Another sign that our culture hasn't been as effective as we would like it to be at quality control is expressed in a tweet by Sanjay Srivastava. This was in response to a replication attempt where the original effect was a really small sample size and a gigantic effect size and a very subtle manipulation and so on. And Sanjay wrote, "This is no shade at the replication researchers, but science is self-correcting will be an empty slogan if we can't collectively get past the place where it takes 22 labs and more than 7,000 subjects to counter a study that nobody should have believed in the first place." So something went wrong. We're starting to correct it, right? The fact that these things exist is a good sign. But I think many of us got complacent and thought that self-correction, because we teach our students that self-correction is a feature of science, that if we're doing science, then it's self-correcting, right? And I think James's tweet captures the problem with that thinking. Okay, so how do we make a research system or research culture more self-correcting? What are the characteristics of a self-correcting, credible research culture? So I'm gonna brainstorm some, and this is by no means exhaustive, and I'm curious what we can all come up with together, and I think this is one of the goals of Metascience would be to come up with some things that we can use to measure the credibility of a research culture. I'm gonna put them in three categories: transparency, quality control, and calibration. And I'm gonna put them in two columns: things that make a science more credible or things that make a science more incredible. So in transparency, the first thing we've talked a lot about already is transparent methods, things like making data and code open, making it reproducible. Pre-registration is another aspect of transparency. Declaration of conflicts of interest is a new thing for psychologists to be thinking about. And crediting contributions, so not just authorship, but recognizing other kinds of contributions as well, so people know who did what, and so on. On the other hand, we have things treating papers as advertisements, so not showing the methods, not giving enough details for someone to critically evaluate what was done. Instead of pre-registration, a culture of take my word, I predicted it ahead of time, trust me. Instead of declaring conflicts of interest, treating things like having given a lot of popular talks and written books as, well, then I have even more authority because look at how popular I am. And instead of contributorship, giving just a few people all the glory with systems like authorship. So transparency is really important. It'll help. It's necessary for self-correction, right? It's very hard to identify errors and correct them if we don't give people the ammunition they need to find our errors. But transparency is not enough, and there's some danger in focusing just on transparency at the expense of the other things on the list. And this was captured in one of a great quote by Andrew Gelman in one of his papers, where he said, "Consider the practical consequences for a researcher who eagerly accepts the message of ethical and practical values of sharing and openness, but does not learn about the importance of data quality. He or she could then just be driving very carefully and very efficiently into a brick wall, conducting transparent experiment after transparent experiment, and continuing to produce and publish noise." Right? So transparency is great, but if we're transparent and we do shoddy research, we're going to be less credible, not more credible. Right? Transparency just gives us the credibility we deserve. But if we want high credibility, then we need transparency plus something else. And one of that something else is quality control. So just rigorous methods, high standards. And one thing I think about when I think about this category is I think about the idea of severe testing in statistics. Deb Mayo has talked about it a lot, as well as others. I think of it as a field's level of severity in general, not just in statistical inference, but in general. Do we have severe evaluation as a culture in our field before we decide that a claim is acceptable, that we want to put it out there, that we want to stake our field's reputation on it? Do we put it to very strong tests? Are we very critical of it? Do we probe it, et cetera? So some ways we can do that is by conducting direct replications or other kinds of audits. We can use forensic techniques to look at how plausible this pattern of results is, like P-curve or other kinds of things. We can encourage for null findings to make it out there, and not just make it out there, but get cited and get incorporated into the narrative of the state of the evidence. We can use tools like StatCheck, Michelle Naughton's tool, and others to reduce the number of unforced errors. So we're never going to have no errors, but StatCheck errors now should be considered unforced errors, right? Everybody can use StatCheck. It's free. There's no excuse for making that kind of error, although I'm sure I will continue to. But we want to reduce the number. And we can use things like open review so that the evaluation of the quality of a product is open not just to the few people who see it during peer review, but to others as well. So when an error is detected, other people can see that too. On the other hand, an incredible field would focus a lot on novelty and would not spend a lot of time or money on replications or other kinds of verification work, would have tons of significant results, have many unforced errors, and would just say, trust us, it's been through peer review, without letting you see how rigorous the peer review process is by surfacing those reviews. Okay, the third category is calibration. So you can do all the right things with transparency, you can do all the right things with quality control, but there's another way you can go wrong, which is that you can exaggerate or overhype your results or just interpret them incorrectly in the direction of too much excitement about them. So things that a field could do to be more calibrated are continuing to peer review something even after it's been published, and again, doing that in an open way. So open critiques and reviews, hopefully linked to the paper itself, so other readers who go and read the paper can see those critiques and calibrate their evaluation. And then corrections, right? What the right number of corrections is for a field. If a field has no corrections or retractions, we should be skeptical. If it has a lot, maybe we should be skeptical. I don't know exactly what the function is between corrections and credibility, but zero corrections would definitely be worrying, right? On the other hand, a field that wants to be incredible would have a lot of flashy press releases and a lot of emphasis on a few famous people and on the amount of impact that people have. So one thing I would add is that this calibration thing is especially important if you have findings that you want to disseminate more broadly, or your field is arguing should influence public policy or change people's behavior and so on. So there's no reason why a field couldn't decide that before we take that extra step, we're going to even have organized post-publication peer review and make sure that it goes through an extra level of scrutiny. The emphasis on impact, one idea I had about this that came up at a conference a few months ago, and I've been toying with it in my head, and I'm curious what other people think, is that a lot of times we assume that all impact is good impact. And that's clearly not true, right? Even if we limit it to citation impact, not all citations are good citations. I recommend Leif Nelson and colleagues' false positive citations paper if you want to see some examples of that. So I think we need to take into account whether the citations were positive or negative. Bobby Spellman has also written about this. But more broadly, there are positive and negative impacts that a person could have on the scientific community, on knowledge. So fame can be good, but it can also be at the expense of the field's credibility. So someone who overhypes their results and stakes the whole field's reputation on that should count against them in terms of their value to the field. Sexual harassment, other kinds of misconduct, that harms the field, and it harms the ability for the field to produce reliable knowledge by driving other people out. That should count against a person's value to the field. And I think it should be possible to come up with metrics or indices that help us quantify a person's value to the field in a way that doesn't just count any attention they get as a positive thing. And I think sports metaphors might be helpful here. So it's something like value over replacement player. If we had things that counted positively, things that counted negatively, we could say overall, is the field better off for having this person in it compared to who would, like an average person that would be in it if they weren't. So I want to emphasize that on this list, these aren't just individual actions. Some of them are. We can declare conflicts of interest, we can run stat check, et cetera. But many of these are collective things that a field can decide to invest in. So a field can decide that they're going to pay for replication studies or verification efforts, or even hire people whose job is just that, like a red team, to make sure their field finds their errors and corrects them. And a field can decide to open up their reviews so that they make their journals more accountable, and they make the information that's produced in peer review available to more people. So a lot of these things are things that a field could decide to do if they really cared about increasing their credibility. So I think all of us have to think about, when we take our meta-scientist hat off and just think about the fields that we're a part of, what those fields are doing to move into one column or the other. And of course, it's a continuum. And I think we need to stop trying to be incredible and try to be more credible, although I put into this website, what's the opposite of incredible? And I think the list of adjectives is pretty interesting. It's a little ambiguous. Okay, so I want to end by talking about some challenges for meta-science. So if I'm right that maybe evaluating a research culture is a little bit easier than evaluating each individual claim, especially for someone who's not in that field, who's not an expert, then one thing meta-science could do is provide metrics about research cultures. We could study different communities, different subfields, but the challenges are things like what should we measure and how? So I had a list on the previous page. Some of those things might be easy to operationalize. Some of those things are likely very, very difficult to operationalize. What do we do when these metrics get gamed? How do we communicate this information? And the goal might be that we as meta-scientists, but also other people, even the general public, people completely outside of science, maybe we could even come up with metrics that anybody could use to assess how different fields and subfields differ in their research culture and how much credibility to assign to those different fields. So I have one more point as we think about how we make fields more credible or incredible. I thought of another quote I read in Susan Hack's book called Defending Science Within Reason. She talks about what are the different signs of a credible field? What is a well-functioning scientific community like? And one of the things she said is you can ask how far conferences manage to be occasions for genuine communication and mutual education rather than mere self-promotion and networking. So we can start right here today and try to engage in more genuine communication and mutual education, critical evaluation, and so on. And I would encourage us to do that all together. So tonight there's going to be separate events for special guests and for general attendees. I made these network models. I hope you're impressed. But if you're going to the gala dinner, I encourage you to join the general attendees afterwards, or whoever wants to come afterwards. We'll be at Dan Gordon's from 7 p.m. onwards, including after the gala dinner's over. So come on over. Let's all mingle together and engage in some mutual education. That's it.
I'm Andrew Smart, and I hesitate to admit I'm from Google. I work on machine learning ethics, and we're dealing with many of the same issues in the field of machine learning. And a lot of the sort of countermeasures that you propose remind me very much of regulatory frameworks, if you look at aviation or medicine or things. And I had this general question about whether you think a regulatory body could be a solution to this, or what, because that's definitely proposed in technology. If you look at GDPR or there's a lot more regulation coming around algorithmic inferences and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I think that might differ by field. So at lunch earlier today, I was talking to people in the medical sciences, and we were talking about the fact that in the medical sciences, there are a lot more regulatory bodies. So for a drug to be approved, there are other steps besides just getting through peer review and getting the scientific community's acceptance. So maybe when there's a lot at stake, there should be regulatory bodies. I don't know. Then there's a lot of questions about, like, how do you decide which fields there's a lot at stake? But yeah, I haven't thought as much about that, but I suspected that one of the factors that might be relevant is how serious the consequences are of getting it right or wrong. Yeah.
Hi, Sean Grant, Indiana University, Indiana. Simine, as always, thanks for the great talk. In terms of credibility being something empirical that we can measure, and knowing that journals are an important part of fields, what would your thoughts be about a credibility factor for a journal instead of an impact factor that's based off of these measures? Pros and cons, gaming, but something that might be more useful in the impact factor as a complement for it.
Yeah, I love the idea, as long as journals are around, which I'm with Drevin on that one. But one thing, so I was editor-in-chief of a journal for 4 years, and one of the shocking things to me was how little I got criticized, how little accountability there was. And when I would see people occasionally tentatively mention that maybe it wasn't so cool that this one journal did this thing, people would pile on and say, oh, but editors are so overworked and it's so hard and so on, and they would back off. And it's no wonder, right? We need editors to like us because we need to publish in their journals. But it's shocking how little accountability there is for journals. If you think about the Reproducibility Project in Psychology that came out in 2015, it focused on just 3 journals, but almost none of the conversation has been about what those 3 journals have done in light of those results. I don't hear anybody talking about that. And yeah, I mean, when we criticize papers, we often put a lot of the blame, if there's a flaw that should have been caught, on the authors, but some of that blame should go to the journal, and we should be tracking overall how well is the journal doing at and not necessarily at only publishing true things, but at truth in advertising. So if they want to be the kind of journal that has a 75% false discovery rate, which Social Psych had in the Reproducibility Project, that's fine if they advertise themselves that way, right? And one of the things I proposed when I applied for a recent editorship was to have 2 sections in the journal. A big if true section, which is where we would publish things that we're not very sure will replicate. There is a warning that, like, this is very preliminary, but we think it's important to get it out there. Maybe it's hard to collect data. Maybe we think getting it out in a very calibrated way will stimulate more research on it. And then a more, like, kind of brick in the wall section for things that are later in that research cycle of like just adding more confirmation to something that we thought might be true. So I think one thing that's hard about holding journals accountable right now is they can kind of dodge. So when things turn out not to be replicable, they're like, yeah, but we were always publishing cutting edge stuff. It's like, okay, well then you need to say that when you're putting out the press releases. You can't just say that when the bad news comes in. So I think part of holding journals accountable is asking them to clarify what their goal is. Is their goal to be publishing the most cutting edge stuff that a lot of it will turn out to be wrong? Or is their goal to be somewhere that readers can go and be pretty confident that it went through really rigorous quality control and is very likely to be solid? And if they state what they're aiming for, then we can evaluate and say, oh yeah, well you're actually more safe than what you say your goal is, or you're actually much less safe than what you say your goal is. So I'm all for more meta-science on journals, providing more metrics about journals. The journal impact factor obviously is a terrible metric, and we need much better metrics and much more accountability for journals.
Steve Goodman, Stanford. So fantastic talk. You did pretty well for your self-proclaimed amateur in the field, I think. Really, really great. So I'll just make a few quick comments. One, reflecting on the one about accountability for journals, and I agree completely. I will say that journals have many dual roles. I mean, New England Journal, publishes very high-risk things because they think people need to know the leading edge of technology, but they also do other stuff that's more routine. So I love the big if true, if they could sort of self-classify whether they think this is a risky first observation or not. And that actually affects meta-research on some of the top journals because they are taking, it's like case mix at hospitals, they are taking risks and they know they're taking risks. Mm-hmm. In other research, they know they're not taking risks. It would be interesting if they could self-label, but I don't think journals have single goals. The other group that's not held accountable because everybody's terrified of them is funders. Mm-hmm. So I'll just put that out there. Yeah. And there's some funders that do a lot of damage because of the way they set their priorities, and we don't. And the really reflective funders actually are very, very aware of this and conscious about it, and they're trying to be socially responsible in multiple ways, but they are never held accountable because they're like the VCs. They hold the keys to the kingdom. But the thing I wanted to mention, which you didn't, but I think is on the minds of everybody here, is Metascience itself has to be held accountable in the same way we're holding everybody else accountable. Some of the foundational papers in this field are profoundly flawed, and because it's now becoming a fad, even though we say it's emerging, it's already, in a lot of the press will tell you here, it's already old news. They can't even publish some of the stuff they used to publish because it's seen as, oh, science is broken, that's old news. So it's very faddish to be very, very critical of many sciences in very, very sloppy ways. Mm-hmm. So we need to be as self-critical of ourselves as we are of other people. And it's not easy because every single thing that we've accused others of character or scientific flaws, we ourselves have. This is science too. So we need to be very, very careful, I think, about how we conduct our own business and jumping on this bandwagon as a field in itself with a lot of people who've never done science. Again, that's okay, but it does reduce the impact, the insight that those scientists have into science. So I'm sure others here could make very trenchant comments on this, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that, well, to your first point about no one dares criticize the funders as well as the journal editors and so on, I mean, my first reaction is, well, that's all the more reason to hire people whose only job is to criticize those things and who don't need anything from those places. So if there were fully funded jobs, like the red team idea, but applied to the whole scientific community, red team the funders, red team the journals, et cetera, and those people need to somehow be isolated from needing any rewards or anything from those groups. But then you ask, okay, well, who's going to watch the red team? Which is kind of like your question of who's going to watch the meta-scientists. And I don't know how to answer that question without infinite regress. I mean, I think that developing a culture of criticizing each other, of calling each other out, of not putting anybody on a pedestal, not doing the hero worshiping thing where so-and-so can't be wrong. So one of my favorite things about Twitter is seeing people who are from the same community and usually agree arguing with each other. That warms my heart whenever I see that on Twitter, and it does happen. I think cultivating that, incentivizing that, but I don't know exactly how we go about that.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Gully Burns, Chan Zuckerberg, Scientific Knowledge Engineering. So I was a little sad to see your red lines along scientific method and all of these other things that are kind of important aspects of our work, right? And so what do you think about a grand challenge for the meta-science community about trying to make domain-specific knowledge more tractable, more understandable, more transparent, more easy to get to, more easy to kind of unpack and understand as a goal, as a kind of a desiderata that would really have an impact. Like, let's imagine that we were able to do that. So we have some algorithms and approaches and methods that take a claim in a paper and can find the evidence that supports that and can evaluate the citation network of that and can kind of pull that out in a straightforward and rapid way. How about if that could be done, and it can't be done now, but let's say 5 years, 2 years, 3 years down the line, we could do it. Wouldn't that be a worthy use of our time?
If we could do it, yes. But I'm pretty skeptical that we can. So some fields, it's just impossible, right? There's so much technical stuff that you need years of education to begin to understand, I think, their papers, from what I understand. I think I'm in a field where that's much more on the other side of the spectrum. And even then, so we study things like romantic love or leadership or things that all of us live every day, and we have a lot of expertise just from being humans. And yet, I see very, very smart people in closely related fields completely missing obvious flaws, or what I consider to be obvious flaws, in papers in my field. It's almost to the point where you need to be like have studied that topic almost to know that this measure of this thing doesn't actually measure it. You know, there's just so much, and I'm curious what the journalists here would say, because I feel like they're in that category of having like almost as much expertise as someone in that field. They have a lot of responsibility to educate themselves. And I think they do a lot of due diligence, but I hear crazy reporting on my field all the time by people who I respect a lot. And so that makes me very skeptical that we could give outsiders domain expertise so that they could judge individual claims in a field.
That's the nature of a grand challenge, though, is to make
Okay.
it pick a hard problem that could have an impact
Yeah,
and to
yeah.
try and address it. So.
Yeah, so I'm all for other people trying. I don't think that's where I'm going to spend my resources, but I mean, hopefully I'm wrong. That would be good if I was wrong about this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Simine, this was fantastic. The question, who will Metascience the meta-scientists, I think, at least on Twitter, has been answered, and it's the 4S folks, right? That's what they say. They say that this is an emerging science, that the way that you put it, right, philosophy of science, STS, has been around for a long time, and what they do is evaluate research cultures and why publics in all countries all across the world believe in science or don't. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not they see us acting ethically and what power science actually has in a society. These are things that are really hard to quantify, but it's what historians do. It's what journalists of all different sorts do. It's what I'm sure you've been seeing on your feed all day. I guess I'm wondering, do you think that those people will ever be able to make an argument to a room like this that's like, if it's not quantified, is believable? Is there any intersection between us and them, even at something like SIPS?
Yeah, so at SIPS specifically, there's growing involvement by people outside of science. It's like not just practicing scientists. And actually one of the sessions was about how we can increase collaboration between things like philosophers of science, sociologists of science, historians of science, science studies people, and practicing scientists in substantive areas. I think there is hope. I don't know. I mean, it's just my impression, but my impression is that there's interest on both sides. There's also some elitism on both sides. I went to the Philosophy of Science Association meeting last year, and the talks on metascience were amazing. And then there were all these other talks that had nothing to do, and there seemed to be like this bubble within philosophy of science, but then a lot of philosophy of science doesn't seem all that interested in talking to practicing scientists. And I think the same is true for practicing scientists. There's a huge swath that isn't interested in talking to people who study science from outside of it. But I think there's a lot more interest that's not being realized right now, even though there's a match in demand on both sides. So I think it's really a coordination problem. And I think societies, not just SIPS, but also AMOS, the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science, whose meeting is going to be in Melbourne in November, and I encourage you all to go. You can look it up online. It's great. So I think these societies that are emerging, I mean, and there are some that have existed for a long time, the Society for Philosophy of Science and Practice, and the other ones have really, really long acronyms, so I can never remember them, but there's several others, well, the 4S one and a few others. I think we just need to start actively inviting each other to these conferences. And I know the tagline for this conference has gotten a lot of criticism, that this is an emerging thing, this has been around. Maybe what's kind of new is that people who have never done meta-science or science studies before, who've just been doing the substantive science itself, are starting to reflect and realize that, oh, maybe there is something here. And so then we need to like connect with the people who have been doing this. And I think there's interest. I think it's about to happen. Yeah.
Hi, Christy Ashwin, again, I'm a journalist. So we do have, I can think of one example where we do have people coming together to actually evaluate sort of credibility of research. And the thing that's coming to mind for me is the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. So this is a group, I guess they're brought together by it's like a government thing. They're not allowed to look at cost, but they basically, the people that are on this panel are experts in evaluating evidence. The thing that I've reported on the most with them is their cancer screening guidelines. And so they basically take all of the available evidence and they rate it, and they have systems for doing that. And the stakes are really high because here it's a lot of money that's being spent, but also people's lives and whatnot. But it's interesting because the people that are on the panel are not necessarily oncologists or radiologists, and so they get a lot of pushback from people in those fields because oftentimes they come to conclusions like basically they don't usually their conclusions are different than say the more vested interests within those fields. But it's kind of an interesting example, but it also requires a lot of investment, and there's a lot of money involved in doing that. And I don't think it's a realistic model for every field, but it is something that exists.
Does that group have leverage over the scientists? Like, does it matter what they think for this? Do they control any of the incentives for the scientists?
That's a good question. I don't. Yeah, I mean they control reimbursement. So they are not their mandate is not to look at costs. So they're not supposed to they're not supposed to evaluate based on like what it will cost society or cost insurers or whatever. But their recommendations are used to make reimbursement decisions later. So there are a lot of interests at play here.
Yeah, because I think like getting people in a field to listen to the people outside the field is really, really hard if the outsiders don't have any leverage. So I think the question is how to get an evaluation body where the consequences
Well, it's interesting
matter.
because they have leverage, but then they don't. So, for instance, there have been changes that they've made. One that comes to mind is with breast cancer screening, and so not all doctors are. And also, actually, probably a better example is with cervical cancer screening. So now their latest guidelines are something like every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on the test. But then there are some pretty good data coming from, I think, ACOG, the gynecologist group, where they're basically like there are financial incentives for doctors to want their patients to come in. If people feel like they need to come get this test once a year, they're sort of perverse incentives. And so even though these new guidelines aren't calling for yearly exams, they're still being done to a large degree.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So I think that the bottom line is it's really hard to change people's beliefs about things and to change medical practice.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of when I was at an interdisciplinary center for 9 months. And so every day we would eat lunch together with historians and other people from other disciplines. And as a social psychologist, I would hear often the criticism that like, oh, your research just relies on college students. And this was a little bit before MTurk really took off. And for the first 4 months, I was like, yeah, you don't get it. You don't understand our field. And it took 4 months of talking to people outside my field every day and having them repeat over and over again that you really can't generalize from college students. Like, of course I knew, right? There was a time before I became a social psychologist when I knew that. Then I forgot it, and I didn't just forget it. I was like, oh, they just don't get it, And so that experience for me made me realize, even with, I don't have that much insight. I don't have, there's no lives at stake, and there's no money really at stake for me. It would make my job a little bit harder if I couldn't just use college students, but there's a lot less reason for me to have been so defensive, and I still was. So I think how to get people to listen to outsiders. And these were people I respected. These were, so I think getting through that kind of circling the wagons thing is really, really hard. And I don't know how we can do that. Yeah.
Hi, Charlie Ebersole, at University of Virginia in the psych department. As always, thanks for the talk. I love your thoughts on this. It seems like the likely timeline for the cultural change that you're proposing will exceed the guaranteed academic research career of most researchers in the academy, being PhD students. So for folks who are in particular with a short and not guaranteed timeline, do you see a tension with the probably length of time it will take to get to the field that you envision or are promoting? And if there is that tension in your mind, do you have any thoughts on how people should approach that?
Can you clarify a little bit more? What's the tension between what and what?
the fact that getting to the place that you're proposing is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of actors buying in and working toward that future. But for most people, they're not guaranteed to still be there when that future comes.
Yeah.
So is that a tension in terms of trying to create change, and how would you kind of talk to someone who's thinking about that tension?
I mean, my answer is going to be really disappointing to you because it's going to be the one you've heard before because I got it from your advisor, Brian. But I think that
If it helps, I don't listen to him.
Okay. I mean, I recognize my privilege in saying this, that the replicability crisis, or whatever you want to call it, hit my field the same year I got tenure. So I didn't have, I was blissfully ignorant, and then I had job security. But I think that you shouldn't compromise your values and what you think is right to be in the field. So you could do what Fiona did and defect to another field, or you can try to make it and see what happens. And there are, I mean, if you're in a PhD program, probably you have a lot of good qualities and skills, and there are other things you could do with your time. I know a lot of people talk about how sad it is that people are leaving the field, and we absolutely need to fix the field, but until we fix it, people should be leaving if they feel like they have to make compromises they're not willing to make to stay in the field. The other thing I would say is that it's very, very hard to predict what is going to get you a job and what is going to get you tenure. There's so much noise in the system that I think it was Mark Twain who said, "When in doubt, do the right thing." So if it's a kind of random or very hard to predict anyway, then I would go with try to kind of be in the field the way that you would want others to be in the field. But there are more specific cases where I would say don't do that. Like if it's, there are individual decisions where being pragmatic is absolutely fine, if it's not like a really big moral dilemma, but something that isn't a deeply held value for you. We all have to make compromises. We have to make compromises in our personal lives. We don't always live, every action isn't in accordance with our principles, so the same is true in our professional lives too. I wouldn't beat yourself up if you don't always do exactly what you think is the right thing to do. But I think if you feel like you're making huge compromises that are keeping you up at night, then get out would be my advice. But if you don't know what the consequences will be of your actions, then pick the path that makes you feel better for now and see what happens. But I recognize that it's easy for me to say that.
Thank you for your thoughts.
Hi, I'm Stephen Sanders, and I'm in the psych department here. So I was really interested in your comment about the gap between what contemporary philosophers of science were telling you and just what's in the textbooks. Mm-hmm. And if you have any insights into how we can change our culture through how and what we teach students, because I came to psychology through philosophy, and I've been repeatedly kind of shocked at the huge gap between methodology classes on the one hand and Phil Sci on the other hand, and how there's just there seems to be like a lot that we could do to improve the state of affairs that we're just not doing. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a really big question about what should we be teaching our students until we clean up our act, because I think it's important to also teach our students what the reality is going to be if they join the field, so they can make an informed decision about whether or not to join the field, but also to try to instill in them a sense of what's wrong with the current status quo and the current practices. And it's really easy to do with undergrads. You don't have to convince them that p-hacking is crazy and that harking, I mean, you talk to an undergrad or anybody who hasn't just been steeped in a culture like this and tell them, like, is it okay to say I predicted something if you didn't actually predict it? It's a pretty easy answer. So I think there's a lot of potential for making a really big difference at the undergraduate education level. I think, like with me and the college student samples thing, like there was a time when I knew that was a problem, so we just need to not corrupt them, right? The intuitions that people come in with are pretty good, I think. But I worry about if we don't also warn them what it's going to be like, what moral dilemmas they are going to be faced with when they enter the field, that we might be setting them up for a lot of disillusionment. So I think there needs to be both the education about how things ought to be, but also education about the realities and the difficulties of carrying out those values. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
No, you did a good job.
Thanks. Okay, last question.
Hey, I'm Patrick Forscher at the University of Grenoble Alps and with the Psych Science Accelerator. So one of the interesting things of observing psychology in the past, decade or so, is that when criticism happens, it could either go really well. So the person who gets criticized could engage with the criticism or say like, oh, you're right, I'll issue a correction or reject the paper or whatever. Or it could go really badly, so it could lead to defensiveness or even like dividing research fields into competing camps, or leading to a politicization of certain issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about, one, what you think leads to the different kinds of reactions, and if you see any systemic changes we could make to encourage some of the better kinds of reactions to criticism.
Yeah, I think Kaylin's talk earlier today got me thinking about this when she and I were talking about the issue of, do the different camps even agree on what counts as better evidence? So I think one of the things that's happening in social psych right now is the people who think there are problems and are pro-reform are coming up with what they think is better and better evidence, but there are other people who don't agree that that's better and better evidence. And so we're kind of talking past each other and the effort sometimes feels wasted or something like that. So I think maybe we need to take a step back and say, well, can we even agree on what counts as better evidence? And if we can't, then should we call ourselves one field? Because what unites us if we can't agree on what counts as better evidence? And I'm exaggerating. There is overlap in what the different camps count as good evidence. I think there seems to be pretty good consensus now that more precision or statistical power or whatever is good. And there are other points I think we agree on. But so I think maybe, and Kaylin said this too in response to one of the questions, that like finding points of agreement helps increase trust between the camps. So taking a step back and saying, okay, what are the things we do agree on? And then let's find where the disagreement starts. And I think it actually starts not at the level of interpreting a specific finding, but like a few steps back of like, what is an ideal design for a study? What is a good way to adjudicate two competing theories or things like that? And I think we could be more productive if we could get to the root of our disagreement. So often I start my talks with Merton's norms and to try to say, okay, I think this should be relatively uncontroversial. There's some details in there that are more controversial, but the idea of universalism, that status and hierarchy shouldn't matter when we evaluate the validity of a scientific claim. Do we agree on that? Do we agree that we should be skeptical and ask to verify each other's claims and not ask other people to trust us if we could show them what they need to be able to verify it for themselves? So I think taking a step back and figuring out, do we even agree on that? And then building on that. Or if we don't, then thinking about we're just wasting our time if we're trying to convince each other, but we don't agree on what are our values, counts as good research or good evidence. All right, thank you.